All right, might as well do this intro before I get caught up in conversations. Hello there, and welcome to Medieval Mondays. It's a show where I talk about everything medieval and try and put a little better spin on it than maybe your high school history teacher did. My name is Michael Fay Vitale. Most of the internet knows me by the Wombat. I am going to be doing this every Monday from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Where I'm going to talk about different aspects of the Middle Ages, including topics such as war, religion, love, sex, and other subjects that may be too sensitive for certain ears. So consider that your warning. I graduated from the University of South Florida with my degree in anthropology, focusing on archaeology and medieval history. So my focus area is the Crusading period, which runs from about 1095 to around 1400, give or take, with a special emphasis on the First Crusade. This is Season 1, Episode 1, and tonight we're going to be talking about the context and the call to the First Crusade. I'm going to get into it here in just a minute, but I wanted to wait for a couple of people to show up, so we'll go from there. No problem, Em. Thanks for stopping by. Is it better for you this time, Kiki? Yay! Huzzah! Hey, Burnwood. Thanks for dropping by. Everybody who's been in here has been a moderator. Awesome. The autofocus on this keeps making the screen wiggle. How you doing tonight, Burnwood? Okay, so when talking about, hey Kurt, when talking about the medieval period, you really have to start a little bit before the medieval period. In around 400 CE AD, whichever way you want to put it, Rome decided that it was going to pull back all of its support systems from anywhere outside of Italy. And this left most of Western Europe in a huge lurch. A lot of people have referred to this time period as the Dark Ages. However, that it's really kind of a bit of a misnomer. It wasn't that people fell into an era of darkness. It was simply the fact that if our government disappeared tomorrow and the construction crews disappeared and the infrastructure to run the power plants and everything else disappeared, we would fall behind in technology as well. So what that set up was a power vacuum, and a lot of different groups tried to fill that vacuum. The one that ended up doing it was the Catholic Church. So we see as we move sort of into the 5th century and 6th century, you start to see the organization of the church as not only the spiritual power, but the military power, and the sort of controller of the secular world in Western Europe. However, at the same time, you have a flourishing empire still over in modern day Turkey, modern day Istanbul, which was at the time Constantinople. And if you fast forward to Pope Gregory the Fourth, he came out with this sort of set of rules for English noblemen to, how they should behave. You couldn't openly attack anyone on the Sabbath or on Wednesdays or on Fridays, or it was a whole set of rules, just bureaucracy. Nobody paid attention to them. And then in late 1094, hello, in late 1094, Alexios Komnenos, who was the emperor of Constantinople, sent a message to Pope Urban II in Italy, and asked for help because he believed, Komnenos believed that the Seljuk Turks were going to try and take Constantinople. So, in effect, what the letter said was, could you send some soldiers to help me defend Constantinople? What ended up happening was Pope Urban II looked at Western Europe and he saw that he had a bunch of princes who really liked to try and kill each other and cause trouble. And he thought, okay, well, I got to get them out of here. So what am I going to do? He did what any politician would do. He started a campaign, and he traveled all around Western Europe, promoting this sort of campaign to go to Constantinople. And that message morphed into, let's go to Constantinople, let's take back the Levant, and let's hint at taking Jerusalem, which Jerusalem is, for anybody who's never been there or doesn't know, it's a city that has been fought over since probably the first time somebody picked up a rock and threw it at somebody. And if history does the course, will be fought over constantly. The Levant is what we consider Syria and other parts of the Middle East. So, I'm sorry, Near East. It's not called the Middle East anymore. This all culminated in 1095 in a place called Clermont, France. Now, a lot of scholars argue about exactly what was said because nobody wrote it down. And the biggest phrase that comes out of it is "Deus vult," which means for the glory of God. And whatever Pope Urban II said at that convinced thousands of men to walk, float, and ride almost 4,000 miles from their home. Now, most people at that time had never traveled more than 40 miles from their place of birth. Some of the nobles had been to Jerusalem, had gone on pilgrimages and stuff like that. But even back then, the really, really rich could travel anywhere they wanted, and the poor dude was stuck at home with the farm. Coolio. Okay. So he gives this big speech, and people go crazy. They decide they are going to go and take Jerusalem back. Now, if you remember, it was to help defend Constantinople, but like all messages, it got a little twisted. And the idea was to send out the army, take a year to gather up supplies, like you have to do with an army, men, and then ship out. At the time, there was exactly, Kiki, playing telephone. There was a gentleman named Peter the Hermit, and Peter the Hermit was one of those hermits who believed himself to be holier than thou, except in a literal sense, he thought he was holier than the Pope. Anyway, he decided that waiting a year was not going to fit well with his plan. So he gathered up anybody who would listen, which was mostly peasants, because the ruling class knew that they needed to listen to the Pope, and pulled a version of "Hold My Beer" and decided to march to Constantinople. Not armed, not outfitted as an army, peasants, with like pitchforks. So they marched and marched and marched. They took the long way and marched some more. They reached the gates of Constantinople, said, "We're here for the Great Crusade, to kill the infidel and take Jerusalem." And the guards went, "Go away." So they were turned away. They decided that they were going to go around. They went around. They ran up against some Turks, and well, Peter survived. That's really all the records say. You don't send a pitchfork against a well-trained army. So, I mean, technically, that was, well, not technically. Allegorically, that was the first crusade, the Peasants' Crusade or the People's Crusade. However, a year later, in the early part of 1096, or I'm sorry, the mid part of 1096, the European army set out. Now, they set out with 5 princes, and I could go through all 5 of them, but it doesn't really matter because the only 2 that count are Geoffrey of Bouillon and Bohemond. And there was Tanrak and Meshach and Abednego. I don't know. And they were the smart ones because they took the boat across the Red Sea. Maybe not. I don't remember the ocean. Did the hermit and peasants consider the Pope evil or unworthy or unholy? No, they Peter the Hermit, he actually comes back into the story a little later, but Peter the Hermit believed that God told him that he was going to be the vanguard, that him and the truly faithful, which he believed were the peasants, not the knights and the princes, would be the vanguard of the crusade, and they would be the ones to reach Jerusalem and fortify it and besiege it for the European knights. They were wrong, because populist movements are almost always wrong. Now, one of the biggest questions that people have is, what convinced these people that had never been more than 40 miles from their house to walk 4,000 miles from the temperate climate of Europe to the desert, wearing leather and metal? The Catholic Church offered what was called temporal rewards. Now these are important because they end up becoming a big thing later when a monk nails something to a door. But these temporal rewards were basically, if you take up the cross, which means if you go on crusade, you are forgiven for all sins that you have ever committed, and all sins you will ever commit. You are given what we would consider carte blanche to do whatever. And that was an appealing thing to a violent, murderous group of people. Oh, they abused it so much, Kiki. So much. But it was encouraged. See, what happened was they started the march to go kill infidels, to go kill Muslims, and to destroy Islam. What they ended up coming across as they traveled through Europe, because they started in France and traveled east, is it went from kill the infidels to these people technically don't believe in Christ, right? I mean, well, they believe in their version of Christ. It was the Jews. There are stories of crusaders coming across Jewish populations and robbing them, murdering them, because they considered them infidels, because they didn't believe the same way. It's horrible. Like I said, there is not a lot of happy, cheery things about the Crusade. It is a very dark period for humanity, and it is definitely a time period where people abused their authority, they abused the privilege that the church gave them, and abused each other. So that is sort of the context of why they did this. Crusade in English, a lot of people don't equate this, because we use the word crusade even today as sort of a noble cause, right? Like I'm going to go on a crusade to, cure cancer or whatever. Crusade is effectively an English word for holy war. It is a war sanctioned by the church to destroy those who would oppose the church. And to an equation, right, two sides have to be equal. The Muslim concept of that is often mistakenly referred to as jihad, which means to struggle, but it's been used, right. It's language is funny. That's another whole thing. So you have this large group of people march to Constantinople, and Alexis the First Comnenus says, "Welcome," and he welcomes all these Crusader knights into the city of Constantinople. And then they decide they don't want to leave. They abuse the hospitality showed by Alexius Komnenos. Some of them think that they can take Constantinople for Rome. Not a great idea. That was the seat of the Eastern Catholic Church, which is now the Greek Orthodox. But yeah, they exact promises from Alexius in order to get them to leave. And when they finally do go, they left Constantinople worse than they found it. So we have technically 5 separate armies, because there's 5 princes, all trying to work somewhat together to make it to Jerusalem. The problem is it's going to take them 4 years to get to the walls of Jerusalem. And during that time, they will take Antioch, which is another of the holy cities. They will take 2 seconds. So totally unprepared. It is Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Cyprus, and Damascus, I think, and of course Rome. I googled that shit, but yeah. Um, and what it was is each of these cities was supposed to be a holy seat. So each one was headed by an archbishop, and there were there were five major ones. There were five archbishops that held the keys to heaven: Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and I don't remember the fifth one off the top of my head. And there happened to be five princes, so those numbers worked out well. But yes, it took them 4 years to move across the desert. Now, one of the reasons I started Medieval Monday this week is because next Wednesday will be the 919th anniversary of the day the Crusaders took Jerusalem, and that's a story. But let's talk about sort of Constantinople and the Seljuk Turks. So Constantinople was the seat of the Eastern Holy Roman Catholic Church, headed by Alexius Komnenos. For all intents and purposes, it is a picture of what Rome was before the fall. Well, not really the fall, but before the sort of downgrading that had gotten in 400. This is a time period when Baghdad was considered the jewel of the Near East. Constantinople was the center of learning, and Europe was seen as a dirty, filthy place full of barbarians. And it's hard to explain. So when we look at the Crusades, what we need to look at is not only, yes, dudes with swords fighting, okay, but the exchange of culture. So when Europe lost Rome's support, things like writings, texts of any kind didn't survive very long, or they were in monasteries that the average person didn't get into, and the majority of the population was illiterate anyway. But they lost the writings of people like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, all the Greek classics, right? The ones that sort of taught the idea of there's something beyond this world. And once Europeans started to flow into the Near East, things started to flow back, right? Because people would leave and go home and take this information with them. So even in the early 12th century, we start to see in Europe what will eventually flourish and become the Renaissance. You see information coming back. You see the ideas of sort of not just a monarchy where the king is God, right? Or the Pope is God, but individual liberties and individual rights. Because one of the biggest misconceptions about especially the Near East is that Muslims ruled everything and hated Christians and hated Jews. And that's just not the case. Islam, yes, did conquer people, and Islam was a bloody religion. But so was Christianity, so was Judaism, everybody was bloody. However, in Jerusalem, Christians, Muslims, Jews, they all lived side by side. Now, Christians and Jews were to pay a tax to who controlled the city, which was the Muslims. But as long as they paid their tax and they didn't outright try and take over the city, they were pretty much left alone to worship however they wanted to. That wasn't the way things were in Europe. And to be 100% honest, it probably didn't work out all that well all the time, right? Anytime a group has power over other people, there's going to be abuses of that power. Welcome back, Kelly. So we have this sort of idea of tolerance that didn't really exist, right? Jews had been kicked out of everywhere, right? That is sort of the story of their people. They would go to a place, be moderately successful. Somebody would decide they don't like it and kick them out. Good Lord. So in Europe, it was kind of right. Like there were people who didn't believe in Christianity, right? They're given any population, there will always be at least an outlier of somebody who doesn't follow the mainstream. However, you didn't talk about it at all. Baghdad was considered the jewel of the Near East. So, calling the Middle East for years, and I'll still slip up and do it. Sort of the Levant, Syria, Iraq, Iran. For years those have been considered the Middle East, right? Because it's not the Far East and it's not Europe, but it's more translated to Near East, which is geographically, if you're not making America the center of everything. So, where was I? Tolerance? Yeah. So with tolerance comes the ideas of different expressions of art. For people that don't know, in Islam, you are forbidden from portraying humans or animals in your art. So that's when you see like a mosque and it is covered with calligraphy everywhere, which are verses from the Quran. It is beautiful artwork, but it was something that people from Europe had never seen, right? By this time, anything that the Romans left behind had been crumbling. Most people were trying to survive and just didn't have time to do a lot of art. And the art that was out there was good. I mean, there's good art. It's just frightening. Also, I don't know if I have anybody in here who's ever been to the UK, but if you taste a lot of, oof, that is one. So the mouth of the Tigris and the Euphrates, that whole area, is called the Cradle of Life because the land there is so fertile. Whether the Garden of Eden exists or not is a theological question that I don't know. But it is certainly sort of where civilization started to come together. So it is definitely an interesting place. But getting back to one of my favorite subjects, food. Food in early Middle Ages in Europe was boiled or burnt. That was how it was. And things like salt and cumin and saffron and other spices that we think of as sort of, salt was the thing because they salted the meat, but spices that give flavor, like really give flavor to stuff. Though a lot of those had never touched the lips or tongues of anyone in Europe. So you go from eating your boiled sausages to experiencing one of my favorite things, hummus, which I actually have I have a recipe, which maybe I'll put in the description of one of these videos, for the oldest known hummus in the world. It's a 12th or 14th century recipe for hummus. And it is really good. If you've ever had hummus, this isn't anything like it. It's made mostly with nuts and chickpeas, and it has cinnamon and clove and saffron in it. It's kind of amazing. And likewise, a lot of the beef dishes and stuff, people in the Near East had never tried. So we get an exchange of culture, an exchange of languages, an exchange of mathematical concepts. It's really hard to explain, and I'm not really going to get into it, but there was no concept of 0 or 1, really. Before the sort of exchange in the early 11th and 12th centuries in Europe, you had none or you had some. I'll maybe do a video on that because it is a really interesting topic, but it takes like 45 minutes to explain. So, because you have to wrap it around your head. So who we got? We got Burnwood, Siddhartha, Kelly, Kiki. I see you, Kiki. All right, so I blabbed on. Questions, comments, concerns, emotional outbursts? Give my voice a break for a minute. Hello, Life Befell the Powells. How are you today? You know, Siddharth, I think that's a question that sane people have been asking for 2,000 years. Jews have historically been blamed for things that they had nothing to do with. And it is probably because they are a smaller ethnic group in most of the places that they were in. But yeah, I don't know if there's I don't know if there is a good answer to that. And it's not confined to history, right? I mean, you can go back 60 years and you can go back 10 years. You can look out there today, and it is, I mean, if you look at Christianity, they are God's chosen people and they are meant to suffer. As for other religious outlooks on it, I don't know. I wish I had an answer. Hello, Pam. No problem, Siddharth. Any other questions? Life Befell the Pals. You missed me just rambling mostly. I talked about sort of why people would march 4,000 miles to the desert. I talked about sort of the idea of Constantinople and why they asked for help. And mostly I've been talking about the culture exchange between the Near East and Europe. And drinking lots of tea because I'm not used to talking this much without taking a break. I will say, Siddharth, that Jews were not alone in being mistreated. From a European perspective, anybody that was different was pretty much treated badly. The idea or the concept of atheism in the Middle Ages was not something that you would talk about, right? Like you're not going to have anybody out there saying, no, God's not real. Because whether you actually believed or not, God was real and religion was religion, and you went to church, because if you didn't, bad things generally happened. The Council of Nicea was 600 something AD CE. I usually say CE just because that's what was beat into my head in history. That's a whole episode in itself, simply because they set down sort of the basis of what modern Christianity sort of looks like. I could definitely cover that one day. This episode is sort of the introductory episode, kind of like conversation about context for the First Crusade. Next week, I'm going to be getting into why, or not why, what happened when the Europeans actually hit Jerusalem and how they took Jerusalem. I'm trying to set it up to where I can have pictures pop up and all that fun stuff, but apparently if I use that program, the sound is horrible. Kiki, they're human like everybody else. I mean, yes, they have been abused as a people in general, but like anybody else, there's good ones, there's bad ones, there's all spectrum. I was answering your comment. So right now my chat disappears. Let's Google that. You are right. I was thinking of another one. Council of Nicaea was in 325. My bad. That is that's a number of years before my expertise. It's 325 AD, held in Constantinople. Yay, Google. Which one am I thinking of? I don't know. The actual operations of the Catholic Church are very strange. Like we see the Pope today as holy guy, right? Like chosen to lead the Catholic Church. You go back to the Renaissance and it was strange. You go back to like 800 and there are some crazy popes. Pope that was died of a heart attack while in bed with his two mistresses. Pope that was killed by his son. The Pope that he died, pretty sure a normal death, but then the Pope after him decided to put him on trial for heresy. So they dug the old Pope up, dressed him in his vestments, and put him on the throne of St. Peter and charged him with heresy, found him guilty, and then tore his body apart and all kinds of stuff. There's a really cool picture out there of It's called the Council of, or the Synod of the Dead or something like that. I don't remember, but it's crazy stories. I mean, it was like the early party days of the church, where they didn't know what they were, and the council that I'm thinking of, and it's gonna bug me, that I can't remember, is started to sort of codify the rules of what popes should do, and yeah, then we have multiple popes, and yeah, um, at one time there were 4 popes. Um, you'll hear a story about a female pope. Most scholars think that's not true. Though I wouldn't put it past somebody. There's, of course, the Medici family, who during the 1600s were popes, 15 and 1600s. A lot of them were popes. Yeah, so the Catholic Church is really interesting to delve into from a historical perspective, not necessarily from a religious perspective, and that's sort of one of the things I want to make clear here at the start is, I am not out to attack any one religion. Um, my goal is to present things from a historical perspective through a modern lens as much as I can avoid it. You can't really. Um, However, I cannot talk about things like holy war, jihad, the struggle, the early days of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, without talking about religion. Um, but I will try my best to not attack a religion. I am personally not religious. However, I have respect for people who have faith. So, if it ever seems like I'm attacking it, call me out on it in the chat. I will do my best to rectify that. But getting back to what I was talking about. So this exchange of culture, for the most part, food, language, math, those things, flowed both ways. What we see is the effects of the European occupation of the Levant are still seen today. So, Near Eastern architecture for the time period, was very rounded. So you think domes, you think rounded walls, you think corners not so right. Right, you get it, right angle. Never mind. It was definitely a more flowing sort of shape. So today, remnants of that still exist, right? So, especially on, I think it's Malta. So you are in a city that was, predominantly built by the Middle Eastern or Near Eastern peoples, and you look up the street and you go from these rounded, sort of flowing lines, right, to the stark fortress that's on the cliff, right? Because at the time, Europeans liked right angles, right? They liked square, definitely function over form, and right, what we see as sort of the fantasy castle, right? The looming spires and the flying buttresses, and that's all much, 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 much later. During the period where Crusaders were going over, everything was built to, pretty much just stay there. Hey, Em, welcome back. So it wasn't until, I want to say, middle of the 1800s that the Knights of St. John, who are technically my specialty. I wrote a almost 60-page paper by the time it was done on the Knights of St. John. They started to build a castle called Croc de Chevalier in Syria, and it was one of the very first European castles to have a round wall. It still stands there today, and I would like to go visit it, but it's in a part of Syria where I don't want to die. So I think I'll put that on hold for right now. The Knights of St. John are a separate holy order. So the Knights Templar are seen as sort of the first holy order of knights. They're the famous ones. The Knights of St. John technically predate them, but not as an organized group. So in Jerusalem, before Crusaders got there was a Christian hospital. Now it's not a hospital like we think of hospitals. It's basically a hotel for pilgrimages. So for pilgrims who were coming to Jerusalem, which was allowed. It was a place where they would take care of sick people and take care of the injured, but it was more for the weary. And they were the Order of St. John, St. John the Baptist. And then over the years, beginning of the 11th century, as the Europeans occupied Jerusalem, they started to mold into the Knights of St. John the Baptist. Their more common name is the Hospitaliers, because it was the hospital of the Knights of St. John. They survived. They survived the purge of the Holy Orders. So the Knights Templar didn't make it through. The Teutonic Knights sort of made it through. The Knights of St. John moved to Malta and became the Knights of Malta. They're still around today. They're a nonprofit organization, international organization that is basically a charity. But yes, so the Knights Templar, their surcoat was white with a red cross. The Knights Hospitalier, the Knights of St. John, they wore a brown tunic with a white cross. They really benefited from the Templars going down because the church and France sold most of the Templar property to the Hospitaliers. They were an interesting group. So there was a peasant uprising in the 1500s in England, where they killed peasants killed a bunch of people, and one of the people they killed was the head of the Knights of St. John, who was there. One of the Knights of St. John interrupted a pope during some kind of council meeting, and basically told him that in probably Latin or Greek to go F himself, and got away with it. So they were pretty influential. The Knights Templar were even more influential, I guess. I am not Professor D.M. Wombat. That is a character in for the my comedy series, which is on Fridays. No, I do not have the time to get a history PhD. I had thought about it, but they take forever, and I'm happy with the degrees I have. If I was to get a PhD, it would be in medieval history, though, especially European history. But yes, Professor D.M. Wombat, Esquire. Pals, no worries, man. None at all. I'm glad you're here. You're more than welcome. Yeah, so this is so YouTube feeds my different passions, right? I love photography, I love history, I love making people laugh. So Fridays, the videos that come out on Fridays, they're all from the sketch group that I belong to, the as yet unnamed sketch group, which is our name. Mondays is medieval history, which is this is season 1, episode 1. And then Tuesdays is Time Lapse Tuesday. So that sort of feeds into my photography habit. And then I throw up a vlog every now and then too. But welcome to the channel. I hope you enjoy it and you will. I don't even want to know what that is. You'll get the hang of it. I have been all over the place since I started my channel. So I'm just now sort of getting a feel for what I want to do. But yeah, so we've got numerous different topics that we're going to cover over the next how many ever Mondays I decide to do this. Next week I'm going to cover Jerusalem and the taking of Jerusalem and the bloodbath that happened when they took Jerusalem and what happened when they lost Jerusalem the first time, because this has been a repetitive process. But then we're going to talk about, I think we're going to go to a lighter subject and talk about sex in the Middle Ages and sex and love and sort of what those concepts are. And then we're going to talk about the influence of religion on people's lives. So Kiki, you're not 12. You have a kid. Also, the subjects in this series may be for adult audiences. So if you have little ones, keep an eye on them. If you don't want them to hear it, don't let them watch it. I try and contain my language. If I'm not, you'll know because your speakers will catch on fire. I can cuss like a sailor. But yeah, there's all kinds of different subjects that I want to cover. I'm going to try and occasionally have a guest in and do like a there's some professors from my college that I would like to talk to, and Joran, who I'm sure everybody knows, is big into Crusader history as well. So I'm going to have him on, and and I'm going to do sort of those things. But real quick before I end this, thank you all for watching and commenting and making me laugh in the chat. Everybody in here, if you haven't checked out people in the channel, there are a bunch of great channels. Go and give them a little bit of support. Make sure you smash that thumbs up for me if you haven't yet. If you like anything that I do, please subscribe, please. And make sure you ring the bell so you know when I go live. I did want to do sort of one plug before I end this. Happy Trails Hiking, who is not in here, has merch. And it is the top 10 reasons to hike. And I got me one. Woo! So I'll be wearing this when I go up to St. Louis and hike. It's a great channel. Definitely, if you haven't checked it out, check them out. Life Fell to Palace. Thank you very much. I will definitely learn more about the Council of Nicaea, because I'm sure it's interesting. I will also find out the name of the one that I'm thinking about, because I can't handle not knowing. I hope everybody enjoyed the stream. It will hopefully gel a little more into an actual show as I go along. Sorry about the hiccup. Yes, they are the top 10 reasons. Yes, Wildlife Wednesdays. So they do a series where they capture wildlife, and it comes out every Wednesday. I'm behind, but it is definitely awesome. Hey, Mr. Mike, it's nice to see you. You didn't miss it, but you're in the last 30 seconds of it. So once again,